Welcome back. We are now going across the Atlantic. America's National Churchill Museum is an important part of the International Churchill world. As you've just seen, it occupies the crypt of the historic Wren Church, the Church of St. Mary Aldermanbury, damaged during the Blitz and then rebuilt brick by brick on the site of Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech as a living memorial at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. The museum is an integral component of the global alliance that makes up the International Churchill Society. It is also a physical embodiment of the special Anglo-American wartime relationship, a relationship that really began 80 years ago with the first wartime meeting of Churchill and Roosevelt off the coast of Newfoundland. It was a meeting that created the Atlantic Charter, a document that came to represent not just the war aims of the Allies, but more importantly, the now fundamental guarantees of freedom and the aspirations of the new United Nations. I'm delighted to welcome Tim Riley, who is the Sandra L. and Monroe E. Trout Director of the museum, and joins us now to discuss the historic significance and the legacy of that moment with some special guests.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and greetings to all of you there in person in London. This is Tim Riley here from the Clementine Spencer Churchill Reading Room here at America's National Churchill Museum at Westminster College, where, as it was mentioned, 75 years ago, Winston Churchill delivered his famous Sinews of Peace address, commonly known today as the Iron Curtain speech. That post-war address, in many ways, was a blueprint for international security that informs and inspires policy that's permitted the West really to wage and ultimately win the Cold War. Earlier this year, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of that speech with an online conference of our own. And today, we examine the milestone of another very important Anglo-American document, that is the Atlantic Charter. And we are very, very pleased to have three individuals with us to inform and really inspire us to examine really the Atlantic Charter and its relevance today. We will have brief presentations by all three, and then we will open the room to questions for our distinguished panels. The speakers that are joining us today are David Woolner. David Woolner is the Senior Fellow and Resident Historian at Roosevelt Institute in New York. He is also a very accomplished author who's published many books about FDR, including his wonderful tome, The Last 100 Days, examining the last 100 days of FDR's life and presidency at that very important time at the end of World War II. He will be joined also today by Jonathan Eyal. Jonathan is the Associate Director of Strategic Partnerships at Royal United Services Institute in London. Dr. Eyal is Romanian by birth, but he's lived most of his life in Britain, where he was educated in Oxford, and I think it's safe to say that indeed he is a world citizen joining us today. And finally, joining us is Alan Packwood. Alan Packwood, to this crowd, does not need much of an introduction. Alan, of course, is the director of the Churchill Center Archives at Churchill College at the University of Cambridge, and a longtime friend of the America's National Churchill Museum and the International Churchill Society. So we have three wonderful panelists here to help us explore not only the Atlantic Charter as a historical moment and document, but also its continuing legacy. We'll explore a little bit about the new Atlantic Charter that was discussed not 80 years ago, but 4 months ago at Cornwall with President Biden and with Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, there in London. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to begin to Alan Packwood, who I know is there in London, to set the stage for us. Alan, perhaps you can tell us a little bit of why particularly Churchill was engaged and interested in the Atlantic Charter. Alan?
Okay, well, Tim, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I was going to start my remarks by saying that it was wonderful to be back on stage and away from the Zoom calls. But ironically, I find myself on stage and the three of you joining by Zoom. But to set the context, the Atlantic Conference was the first wartime meeting between Churchill and FDR. And it took place, as we've just heard, off the coast of Newfoundland between the 9th and the 12th of August 1941. And the main result of that meeting was a joint declaration of common aims that came to be called the Atlantic Charter. And of course, I have to be very clear here and say these are common aims. They are not war aims, because at this point, of course, in August 1941, the United States is not yet in the conflict. Pearl Harbor has not happened. I think it's vitally important to understand, first of all, that Churchill did not cross the Atlantic in August 1941, braving U-boat-infested seas, with the intention of producing the Atlantic Charter. He crossed the Atlantic because he wanted greater American involvement in the war in Europe. Ideally, he wanted America to enter the war in Europe. And of course, that had been a central plank of his policy of waging war since the assumption of his premiership 15 months earlier in May 1940. Within days of his becoming prime minister, his military leaders, his chiefs of staff had told him that Britain would only be able to fight on in the event of a French collapse if the United States was willing to give full economic and financial support. And the chiefs of staff minuted, without which we do not think we could continue the war with any chance of success. And during the Blitz, he called on the old world and the new to join hands to rebuild the temples of man's freedom. And in private, of course, he told his private secretary, Jock Colville, that no lover ever studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt. So in August 1941, he makes the journey to Newfoundland because Roosevelt has asked for a meeting. And because this is a meeting that Churchill has been desperately waiting for and actively seeking for so long. He goes because he believes this might signal a change in presidential policy towards US entry into the war. And he goes because he believes in his own ability to convince the president of the necessity of greater American intervention. So he's seizing an opportunity. So my second point, which flows, I think, naturally from the first, is that the Atlantic Charter is not the result that Churchill anticipated from this first wartime meeting with President Roosevelt. He wants concrete measures, and of course he does get some. It's agreed, for example, that the American Navy will escort British convoys west of the 25th meridian, thereby freeing up British resources in the Atlantic and also making it more likely that US forces will be attacked and therefore America dragged into the war. Roosevelt agrees to protect the Azores if the Germans move against Portugal and to take a harder line against an increasingly bellicose Japan in the Pacific. But at the end of the meeting, the British are actually left frustrated that America is really no closer to sending forces into the European theatre. So why did Churchill co-author the Atlantic Charter? It's clear that the document comes out of the private conversations between the Prime Minister and the President, conversations that were not minuted. We simply do not know what they said to each other in this first crucial meeting in private. And David can speak to FDR's motivations and intentions, but let me briefly speculate on Churchill's. Firstly, I think he understood the importance of symbolism. He knew that this was a deeply symbolic moment, one that was going to be broadcast around the globe. He knew it was going to be broadcast around the globe because he took his own film crew with him, and also 2 journalists. And he took enormous steps to choreograph the occasion, deliberately stage managing that famous divine service on the deck of HMS Prince of Wales on Sunday the 10th of August, when British and US sailors were pictured standing side by side singing, "O God, our help in ages past," and "Onward, Christian soldiers." And those images, of course, sent a really powerful message of America standing shoulder to shoulder with Britain. And the Charter achieved the same thing, but it achieved it with words. And I don't need to tell this audience that Churchill knew that words mattered. To him, the most important provisions of the Charter were not those about respecting the rights of nations to choose their own boundaries or of peoples to choose their own government, but rather those that spoke about establishing peace after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, or facilitating freedom of the high seas and of disarming aggressor nations. This was an Anglo-British document, this confection, and those are the clauses in which I think you can most clearly see Churchill's hand and his input, because those clauses, those words, are a continuation of his simple, stated policy of waging war until victory. So, Churchill embraced the Charter out of necessity, but he did not do it blindly. He knew that its clauses about self-government would cause him problems with the empire, as they did. He knew it would cause him problems with his Soviet ally, who wanted domination of Eastern Europe. But it accorded with both his short-term and his long-term aims. His short-term aim was survival, and for that, he needed to be in accord with President Roosevelt. His long-term aim was a new world order in which Britain and the United States worked together to guarantee global security. It's the same vision that he articulates 5 years later at Fulton, Missouri. And for that, he also needed to be in accord with President Roosevelt. So the Charter, I think, has to be seen as a product of a moment in time. But it's interesting because, like Churchill's speeches, it also transcends that moment and becomes something bigger. It becomes a founding document for the new United Nations. Not all of that could be foreseen in August 1941, but of course that doesn't make it any less important of a moment.
Alan, thank you very, very much for that overview. I think if turnabout is fair play, you talked about Churchill's motivations. Perhaps we can go to David, and you can tell us a little bit about the story from FDR's point of view. David?
Thank you, and thank you, Alan. That was a wonderful summation of Churchill's position at this critical moment in the history of the 20th century. I think, and I assume you can hear me all right, I think that the critical thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about Franklin Roosevelt is that from a very early stage, Roosevelt hoped to, Roosevelt, let's put it this way, concluded very early on that the security of the United States was directly linked to the security of Great Britain. Here I think it's important to remember as well that Roosevelt always felt that the Atlantic was the critical theater for American safety. And in spite of the skepticism of his own chiefs of staff about Great Britain's ability to survive in the wake of the fall of France and the Low Countries in the spring of 1940, I think FDR really refused to give up hope on the British ability to survive. And in fact, he really began this effort long before the momentous events that took place in the spring of 1940. For example, we could look to his invitation to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth to his home in Hyde Park in June of 1939. Here, he had the famous hot dog picnic up at his hilltop retreat, which we call Top Cottage, where the king and queen were, dining on hot dogs for the first time in their life. And Roosevelt felt this was very important to show the American people what he called the quote unquote essential democracy of the British monarch. A further commitment can be seen in the famous destroyer for bases deal that took place in September of 1940, when Roosevelt agreed to turn over 50 old mothballed destroyers to Great Britain in exchange for the U.S. being granted territory to construct bases in British territory to construct bases in the Caribbean and in Newfoundland, and the critically important promise that the British fleet would never be surrendered to the Germans as a consequence of the war. Again, the Atlantic being so important to him. So, I think it is very important. And if you study the documents, it's very interesting to see just how much Churchill viewed the Atlantic and Great Britain as really vital to American security all the way through this period, again, even before the ultimate fall of France in the spring of 1940. And I think this is part of the reason as well that he initiated the correspondence with Churchill in September of 1939. On the other hand, Roosevelt had a real dilemma on his hands because he had to convince the American people to adopt this point of view. And as you all know, the American public and the American Congress in particular were particularly hostile towards European and especially British imperialism. Feelings, I think, that stemmed in part from the sense that the United States had been somehow duped into joining the First World War, feelings that were exasperated by the bitter legacy of war debts, and the sense that the only people who profited from World War I were bankers and war profiteers. So, he had a real uphill road to climb in trying to convince the American public that they needed to do all they could to support the British war effort. We see this rhetorical effort, and I've always argued that Roosevelt always operated sort of on two levels simultaneously. On the one hand, his rhetorical sense to always point towards documents like the Atlantic Charter, where he spells out a kind of vision for a better world that we would all hope to live in. But there's also the hard-nosed Roosevelt, who behind the scenes is a statesman having to deal with American interests and American security in dealing directly with Churchill and directly with Stalin. And the Atlantic Charter fits very much into this mold. So too, by the way, does the Four Freedoms. Of course, the Four Freedoms Address is Roosevelt's most famous speech, but most Americans don't realize that it actually was part of his State of the Union address on January 6, 1941, where he went before the US Congress. Again, this is right after making his famous proclamation in December of 1940 that the United States should become what he called, quote, the great arsenal of democracy. And his determination now to figure out a way to help the British survive, even though they could no longer afford to pay for war material on a cash and carry basis and so forth. And in that speech on January 6th, he basically is asking the Congress and the American people to support what would become Lend-Lease, the Lend-Lease Act, which was passed on the 11th of March, 1941. That's going to require the American taxpayer and the American Congress to appropriate money to support this idea. And at the end of the speech, he sort of rhetorically asks the question, why should we do this? And that's when he famously said, in future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded on four fundamental human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is the freedom of each person to worship God in their own way everywhere in the world. And of course, the third is freedom from want. And the final one is freedom from fear. These latter two are very important, of course, because it's a huge expansion of American foreign policy to include freedom from want and freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom from poverty, destitution, and so forth. And what Roosevelt does over the course of the war is build on this idea that the security and well-being of people in distant parts of the world was directly tied to the security and well-being of the people of the United States. As he said in his 1944 State of the Union address, which is often referred to as his Economic Bill of Rights speech, he's again, reflecting on the wartime experience. He said, we've come to the conclusion that necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff with which dictatorships are made. So Roosevelt is approaching this whole exercise of putting together a joint statement of common aims with Great Britain, with the idea of wedding the British war effort with his kind of future vision for that better world that he first articulated in his Four Freedoms Address. And in order to secure that better world, and again, this gets into some of the hard-hitting aspects of Roosevelt's motivations. His Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, Sumner Welles, his critical aide, who was very much involved in drafting the Atlantic Charter, firmly believed that they had to establish a post-war world order that was based on freer trade, that saw colonialism and imperialism as a thing of the past. And what Roosevelt hopes to do is sort of frame these motivations and issues in a way that would be palatable to the American public and would resonate with the American public, a public, as I said earlier, that was very hostile towards British imperialism. So it's no surprise to me, that the second clause talks about, or the third clause talks about respecting the rights of people to choose the form of government under which they would live. And the fourth clause talking about the furtherance of freer trade and access to raw materials, et cetera, et cetera. These were the critical issues from Roosevelt's perspective, because as I said, his generation was firmly convinced that the war actually had economic causes, that it was the desperation caused by the Great Depression, which we must remember was a global economic crisis, that gave rise to fascism in Europe and Asia. So for Roosevelt, the war was not just about defeating the Axis powers on the military battlefield. It was also very much about establishing a post-war world economic order that would open up the world's markets, open up access to raw materials. Again, if you think about Japan's incursion into Manchuria and China in the 1930s, again, frustrated by their lack of raw materials, et cetera. He saw the Atlantic Charter as a building block towards establishing this new world order that he hoped to embrace and that he wanted the American people to embrace. So in a sense, it's interesting that, Churchill is, of course, desperate to come to Newfoundland to seek a declaration of war. But I see this invitation as not all that different from the invitation that he extended to the British royal family in 1939. He wants to, it's a part of this process that he's developing to bring the British and the Americans close together, but under a framework that he can convince the American people to endorse. And that was a big challenge for Roosevelt, and one that, without Pearl Harbor, we don't quite know what might have happened. But I'll leave it there, and we'll leave it open for questions.
Well, thank you, David. I think, the 8 points of the Atlantic Charter were certainly aspirational, and we could debate maybe in some of the question period whether or not the aspirations came to pass. But I think one of the things we like to do here at America's National Churchill Museum, and certainly the International Churchill Society at large, is use history as a launching point. Use history and the past to inform the present so we can perhaps build a more stable future. And to that extent, I'd like to ask Jonathan really to put in context the new Atlantic Charter and how did this meeting off the coast of Newfoundland 80 years ago really inform President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson 4 months ago when they met in Cornwall, and which they developed in the new Atlantic Charter, which is also an aspirational document. Maybe you can speak to that, Jonathan.
Thank you. So 80 years ago, the US President and British Prime Minister stood together promising a better future. Today, we do the same. That's how Prime Minister Boris Johnson described the signature of the so-called New Atlantic Charter on the margins of the G7 summit in Cornwall in June this year, as Tim just mentioned. Now, of course, his move immediately attracted the usual brickbats from all the different quarters. There were those who pointed out that the original Atlantic Charter was about managing war rather than managing peace. There were other critics who pointed out the sort of points we heard today, that both sides came out rather disappointed from the original Atlantic Charter, both of the originators. And then there was the ever-skeptical media, which branded the entire affair of the New Atlantic Charter as a sort of PR exercise by a British Prime Minister who always dreamt of benefiting from what Johnson himself liked to call the Churchill factor. So as Richard Evans, the Cambridge historian, put it in June this year, unlike the original, the so-called New Atlantic Charter is unlikely to change the world. Well, of course, all historic analogies are problematic, and it's easy to poke fun at politicians reaching out for historic props. I have no doubts that Boris Johnson had more immediate political objectives in mind when he pushed for the signature of a New Atlantic Charter. And yes, the somewhat self-regarding comparisons to Churchill and Roosevelt by Biden and Johnson may also seem a bit risky, or shall we say premature. But there are a few serious messages from this June episode. First, that 80 years on, the original Atlantic Charter has an enduring and profound impact on our political culture. If it wasn't like that, then nobody would have bothered to evoke it. Secondly, that regardless of the continuing disputes among historians about what the Atlantic Charter did or did not achieve, it is seen as a foundation document for a new world, and therefore it is, people today try to achieve the same effect. And thirdly, and perhaps just as importantly, the original Atlantic Charter presented the US-UK relationship as a critical element in the creation of a new world, and proclaimed the transatlantic link between the two English-speaking nations as a required pillar for the construction of new foundations. So if you accept my three suppositions, then I believe that the label of the new Atlantic Charter does indeed make sense. For the world is entering into a new era of strategic competition. After the fall of communism and the collapse of the Soviet Union, you all recall, it appeared that the world was heading towards what used to be called the strategic convergence in favor of a rule-based order. The newly emergent Russia was hoping to transition to democracy, and China seemed to be preparing to leave its communism behind, embrace free market, and engage in liberalization. But this notion of strategic convergence proved to be a myth. And the challenges that posed by China and Russia today are setting the terms for a new strategic competition between democracies and autocracies that is likely to play out for the foreseeable future. And I think there's two common features to that. First is their use of economic and diplomatic coercion to pressure states, particularly those along the peripheries of Russia and China. And secondly, it's the use of disinformation to discredit our institutions and to portray as our societies as yesterday's story, as political systems doomed to extinction, rather like dinosaurs. So my proposition is that the world is at an inflection point, and surely we are not fighting an actual war as our nations did when the first Atlantic Charter was concluded in 1941. But we are fighting for the survival of the system we put in place then and which served us well for 80 years. So the challenges facing us are just as existential as they were in 1941, although of course it doesn't feel like that. Now, what does the new Atlantic Charter seek to achieve? Essentially, I believe there are 6 priorities, and like the original Atlantic Charter, they just lay the foundation for those priorities. The first one is we need an agreement between us on the strategies to deal with the challenge of Russia and China. Secondly, we need an agreement that provides for better technology cooperation between our nations, both in order to retain our technological lead and to prevent technologies from seeping to our rivals. We need joint action on nuclear proliferation, which is again becoming a big problem. We need an agreement on the reform of the global economic system, perhaps an evolving new Bretton Woods system. We need a joint and assertive political campaign to combat authoritarianism on all cyber platforms and combat conspiracy theories peddled on social media by Russia, China, and their collaborators. And of course, we need cooperation on climate change. Now, you hardly need me to tell you that the UK today is not the UK of 1941 in terms of its global reach. And yes, I agree, the US may also not be the dominant power it was during our lifetime. But the new Atlantic Charter can act as a catalyst for creating new alliances. I'm not so sure about the currently fashionable ideas urging the creation of an alliance of democracies, as it is called, by either expanding existing institutions such as the G7 or by creating new institutions. I think we need to be careful not to undermine the existing institutions by a quick expansion which can dilute their significance and efficiency. We also need to be careful not to give the impression that there is a glue which binds our democracies together in a way which permanently excludes anyone else. It is also important for us to be humble about, how shall I put it, our own problems as democracies at the moment, which are not small. And yes, we should avoid creating an unnecessary debate about values which will create global divisions between those we consider democracies, those we don't consider democracies, or those we may consider marginal democracies. I only need to mention the case of, Indonesia or India as classic examples of this kind of debate, which I don't think is very productive. So I think it is better for the UK and the US to act as a beacon rather than always as the leaders. And the criteria for choosing our partners in this new Atlantic Charter enterprise are actually quite simple and clear. We are together with those who share our strategic perspective, who have our understanding of our strategic priorities, and we are together with those who are ready and capable to help exercise global influence. There should, therefore, the Atlantic Charter is designed in this way to create a variable and very broad geometries of countries in order to deal with a very broad set of challenges that require cooperation. So we can operate in a variety of structures, such as the E3, for instance, the so-called E3, the European three of the UK, Germany, and France, such as the Five Eyes, such as the Quad of Japan and Australia and the US and India, or indeed the lately forged Australia, UK, US arrangement. All of them complement each other in a variable geometry principle, which I would submit was obvious to Winston Churchill, not only in 1941, and I think obvious also to Roosevelt, but also during the first half of the 1950s when Churchill returned to office as a British Premier. So in sum, I would say we can't recreate the Britain of 41. We can't recreate the props of 1941, but we have plenty of successful lessons to draw from the first Atlantic Charter, and we should not be ashamed about promoting the second one. Over to you, Tim.
Well, thank you very much. It's a lot to unpack here in the time allotted, and I'd like to take some questions from the audience, both in London and also online. And I understand in London you're monitoring the online questions, but I'd like to begin with one question, inspired by something that Alan, you mentioned, that we know in that pre-war moment, at least pre-war for the United States, Churchill's endeavor to woo President Roosevelt in the United States to engage more fully in the war effort, as you suggested, was one of his aims. Taking that sentiment and that thought, and Jonathan, looking at the new Atlantic Charter, some have mentioned that perhaps Prime Minister Johnson was looking to woo, or at least look to the United States in similar fashion, to, in a post-Brexit world, look to the U.S. and engage the U.S. Would you like to make that comparison or comment? Was the new Atlantic Charter in some ways an effort to, on Britain's part, at least, to engage the United States more fully, perhaps for economic gain?
Do you want me to answer that, Tim? Or?
Please.
So yes, without any doubt, I think that there were a few elements. First, there is this sort of feeling that we are under siege and that we are being again pressed In the case of Europe, it's pretty obvious what is happening with Russia. In the case of China, it's becoming obvious even to the Europeans, although they took their time to understand this. But I think that there was a deeper discussion. Of course, part of it is the usual discussion that we've had for years on this side of the Atlantic about how Atlantic or transatlantic the United States can be. And it doesn't help how many times American officials tell us that, to use the American parlance, they can walk and chew gum, or that they could have a presence in the Pacific and a presence in the Atlantic. It's inevitable that there would be fears in Europe about that. And it was particularly unnerving. The appearance of Donald Trump was particularly unnerving, not only because of the policies of the individual, but because it appeared for a while that almost nothing was sacred. You know, even the supposed US withdrawal from NATO was apparently crossing the mind of the man in the White House. The kind of stuff that was really the sort of, you know, the completely incredible. So there's a big debate going on, not only in the UK, but throughout Europe, whether Trump is an exception to the rule, an accident of democracy, or a product of American democracy. If he's just an exception. So a lot of what you saw about the reaction of the Europeans to Biden, which looked rather curious because it was very reserved to Biden, was based on this assumption that we still do not know whether Trump is the exception or Biden is the exception. Now, that debate was very quickly disposed of in the case of Downing Street, for the very simple reason that there is this sort of feeling still that we can influence the United States. There is still that sort of feeling that we can engage with the United States. And so a lot of the pressure of the Prime Minister about pushing for a new Atlantic Charter was based precisely on using big words, on using big brand names, if I can use a 21st century term, in order to imprint on the American psyche and the American public the importance of the transatlantic link.
So we will open it up to some
Catherine,
audience questions, and as ever, those of you in the live audience, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. For those of you online, please continue to submit your questions. We have some questions in the back. If you can just wait for the microphone.
Yes, thank you. How has the salience of this attempted new Atlantic Charter been affected by the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan and by the suspicion that America may be more sympathetic to the EU and specifically to Ireland in the Brexit ongoing negotiations than it is to the UK?
Jonathan, would you like to take that one?
Yes, I'm sure that other panelists will also have something to say on that, so let me just be very brief. Of course, it was a shock. If you saw the emergency debate that took place in the House of Commons a few days after the fall of Kabul, this was the first occasion since Suez in 1956 that most of the conservative backbench MPs, namely the Conservative Party MPs, criticized the United States, something that very rarely takes place. And you had Tom Tugendhat, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons, referring to Biden's decision as shameful, his words. These are not words conservative politicians usually use. So I would say that it was an impact, but I think one needs to keep it into perspective. It is not Vietnam in 1975. The US was not defeated. The withdrawal was not because there were demonstrations on the streets of America's cities. There was no collapse in American morale. In fact, the American military was insisting on staying there. The operation was botched, was badly organized, but quite frankly, the Americans don't have monopoly over botched military operations. And let's face it, we withdrew most of our assets from Afghanistan by 2014. So I think a bit of humility on the British side is required as well. But I think what has happened immediately thereafter is the revelation of the UK, US, Australia deal, which of course nobody could talk about at the time, but was going on in parallel, which does indicate that when the chips are down and it comes to some critical defense cooperation, including the most critical of all on nuclear cooperation, surprise, surprise, it's the same crowd, and it's the UK and the United States. So I think that the message from the Australia affair is that the relationship on the military intelligence side remains unshaken. The Irish situation is there. Quite frankly, there are a lot of British politicians who are trying to work out what the British government is trying to do about Northern Ireland. So Mr. Biden will not be the only one to ask that question. The so-called Irish lobby was always powerful in the United States. I think David will attest to the fact it was a hindrance at the beginning of the First World War. It was a hindrance at the beginning of the Second World War. It was a hindrance in the 70s and 80s when the IRA was openly collecting money on the streets of New York for a terrorist organization. So it's one of these things we have to carry in our baggage.
We have time for one last short question and short answer before we have to head to the break.
Just a quick question of something, Dr. Eyal, you said about the Churchill factor. To what extent do you think that modern politicians seek to play big statesmen, and how do we get them to focus back on creating better international policy?
Can I come in on this one while
Yes,
Jonathan thinks? So, I mean, if I can give my answer on that, I would say there is too much focus on Churchill as the big statesman. And perhaps too little focus on Churchill as a collaborative politician. You know, one of the reasons that he has such a long political career is that he was able to work with others. He works with Lloyd George and Asquith during the Edwardian period, and during the Second World War, of course, he leads and maintains and sustains a coalition government across all of the main free political parties. You know, of course, he's leading that government from the front. He's doing that very visibly, and he's also doing it very audibly with his speeches. And that has led perhaps to a focus on that at the expense of what he's doing politically behind the scenes. And perhaps there should be more of a focus on that.
I might just add that Franklin Roosevelt once described Churchill as an idealist and himself as a realist. And so, you know, it's an interesting thing to think about from Roosevelt's perspective. You know, as I said, these aspirational documents, the Four Freedoms, the Atlantic Charter, which, and of course, I failed to mention he would repeat the Atlantic Charter and tie subsequent documents to it again and again and again. But, you know, near the end of his life, he said that it was always meant to be an aspirational piece of writing, something about creating a better world in which we would all like to live. But just like Churchill behind the scenes, Roosevelt too had to be a collaborative politician and spent much of the war trying to manipulate and maneuver the American people into embracing a sense of global responsibility. And if there's one thing that I might add to all of this, I think that is really the critical question on the table right now. To what extent will the United States continue to live up to its global responsibilities?
Well, on that aspirational note, unless there's any short last word, I'd like to thank Tim, Alan, Jonathan, and David for joining us today and for taking part in a wonderful discussion about the ANCM.